get us started. Hi, everyone. I'm Tammy Jonas, the president of the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance, and very delighted to be here right now with David Holmgren, who I'll introduce in just a moment. We like to start these sessions, though, first with an acknowledgement of whose country we're on. I'm personally on the lands of the Jara people, the lands of Jajawarong, and I acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging, and also acknowledge that these are unceded lands. If you could all tell us in the chat window whose lands you're on. It's a very grounding practice, we think, at the start of our sessions in solidarity with the original owners of these lands. Thank you. The Solidarity Economy sessions that we've been doing for the last few months in a response sort of to COVID, really, are because we've seen the solidarity economies that are actually taking place around the country already that exist, like CSAs, like cooperatives, like permaculture communities, lots of bartering in local communities. We've seen that those communities are faring pretty well in the pandemic, all things considered. But the capitalist economy is not functioning so well, it would seem. So instead of worrying at those problems, we thought we'd start a series that shares with you what are the alternatives. People often wonder, what are the alternatives to capitalism? We thought, well, we know quite a few of them, and so let's do a series to show you some of what those are. And so tonight we have David with us, one of the co-founders of Permaculture. I don't think needs much introduction. And we're going to have a bit of a chat around permaculture, food sovereignty, solidarity, and what could the future look like. We want these to be positive sessions, kind of visioning the future that some of us are fortunate enough to be partially living already. I'd like to request that just before we start, if you can all turn on your videos briefly so that we can all see each other and give a little wave and say hello. It's a really nice thing to actually see people, even though we will turn them back on for reasons of bandwidth. It's very nice to see your faces. Hi, Annalise from Japan. So good to see people tapping in from all over the place. This is great. Thank you. Hello. Great. And now the protocol for the session will be that while I ask Dave questions, we'll have videos off for bandwidth, but when we come around to Q&A session, we'll have you, if you have a question, we'll actually have you turn your video back on so you can ask it in person rather than just in the chat. But if you have a burning question while Dave's talking and you have something you want to put into the chat, feel free to do that too, and we'll try to get to those questions as we go as well. So without further ado, I'd like to move into, I think it's our 5th Solidarity Economy session. I should know this, but anyway. And yeah, today we're going to talk permaculture solidarities. So Dave, you and I are neighbors. I mean, we're fortunate enough to be in a community together and actually do quite a lot of, we're involved in quite a lot of little barters here in our world already that you and Sue have been involved in for much longer than I have. Really founded many of the good activities of this area. And I'm interested in your thoughts on, given you're here with the Food Sovereignty Alliance, you know, what do you think is a permaculture perspective on food sovereignty? What does it mean in the permaculture world, according to you?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose permaculture as a concept came about a long time ago in the 70s, certainly before I heard of the concept of food sovereignty or even food security. But the idea of local production under local control was implicit in permaculture from the beginning. The idea that food, the basic needs of food, and certainly perishable foods, needed to be produced close to where people live. And that closeness and scale meant that it's possible and logical and efficient for that to be under local control. It's the scale of globalized production and the control of the transport, movement and processing, where the control of that food supply ends up being invested in large structures beyond people's control. So that was really, in a way, that focus on what's energetically and ecologically efficient just by default reinforces a political context of sovereign control. So I think that's probably the first thing. And then the second one is food production that's using cyclical, that is renewable rather than non-renewable inputs and non-toxic inputs, because those renewable inputs of renewable fertility are again sort of things that emerge out of the farm ecology, out of the local community economy of exchange of resources, of wastes coming back from human systems back into food, rather than, again, the globalized production of synthetic fertilizers, which by its nature involves large corporations and global logistics. And similarly, I think it's true in control of pests, of using natural processes to do that, that internalizes it to the production system. And clearly the regeneration of soil, water and biodiversity are essential underpinnings, because if those frameworks are falling apart, then it's hard to, no matter how much we can claim, if we like, political control or autonomy, if the biological basis of our food production is falling apart, then our food sovereignty, means nothing. And then production that also minimises dependence on complex technology that's not able to be produced or at least maintained within a farm or bioregional economies, again, reinforces that the capacity for things to be done at a small scale, in exchange, relationships between people and small businesses and farmers that are equitable exchanges, rather than attempting to negotiate or deal with structures which have vastly greater power, because those relationships are inherently exploitative. And this is something that comes out of understanding not just of political systems, but of ecological systems, that it's very hard for some small entity to trade equitably with some very large, powerful one. So I suppose those things would, even though the concept of food sovereignty was not there in the beginning of permaculture, that they all contribute to the concept.
That's great. That's a really nice intro to food sovereignty and permaculture kind of at the same time, isn't it? And it is interesting that food sovereignty as a concept doesn't emerge really until the 90s, although it's kind of contested whether it started in the 80s in Mexico as a concept, but definitely later than permaculture. But then all of this comes out of peasant agriculture, essentially, which is, the peasant studies is a much longer field that has understood the need to control your resource base and to have equitable structures of power within communities, that sort of thing, for much longer. That's a really interesting perspective.
And certainly the sources of inspiration and information for permaculture as a design system was to look at indigenous and traditional ways of agricultural production as models for designed post-industrial systems. So that again was the source on which permaculture drew as, if you like, a modern, post-industrial ecological concept, was a fairly early recognition that, those indigenous and traditional cultures of place had, if not the exact systems, the principles of design of those systems was what we needed to emulate in the future.
Yeah, like that that definition that does the rounds bit of sustainability being dealing justly with future generations. You know, that's built into Indigenous ways of thinking of the world, right? As opposed to the post-industrialist sort of thinking. Yeah, that's great. So building on that then, I guess, I mean, you're the foremost expert, I suppose, in the world actually on permaculture, David. That might be who we're talking to tonight. I'm interested in what you think about some of the permaculture strategies that actually are building the food sovereignty movement already. And I think it's really timely that we have these discussions about people who think of themselves as permaculturalists or people who think of themselves as food sovereignty activists. And this conversation is partially an opportunity to understand how we're all both, if these are the things we're doing.
Yes, well, definitely. I've certainly been at one of my roles within the permaculture movement. Like any movements, they can get to be internally referencing. And, one of my roles over the years and decades has been to point to the kindred networks and synergies between them, and the crossovers between them, and I see a lot of that can be emphasised a lot more rather than that focus on difference or what distinguishes people who might be critiquing or developing some other models than the centralised, standardised systems that globalised capitalism has delivered. So I suppose in terms of the permaculture strategies that actually rebuild and retain food sovereignty, I think we need to go back to the basic one of polycultural systems rather than monocultural systems, and those polycultural systems that integrate both annual and perennial plants along with animals to provide a nutritionally diverse diet that's attuned to bioregional and seasonal patterns. I mean, I think that's sort of fundamental because it connects to what is both traditional and emerging cultures of place. And certainly in places like Australia, we see as a migrant hybrid culture that there are many traditional cultures of place, both migrant and indigenous, that contribute to how we have to build new cultures of place. And of course, the foundation of any culture is food and agriculture. And so I think the resisting the tendency and actively resisting that tendency to monoculture, which is sort of built into capitalism through the maximum yield fallacy, that there's one crop that will sort of be the best thing to grow in one particular place. And then that gets shoved into the market system, and the market system creates the diversity for the consumer. To rather look at what is the natural complementarities of a place and thinking of that, more directly feeding people without such complex pathways to provide obviously the diversity that there should be in a diet. And of course, again, we can see in traditional systems, there always was that polyculture in some form, and that integration of animals and plants together. The second one, I think, to do with something that perhaps hasn't been so associated with permaculture, but thinking about land tenure systems that allow people to re-inhabit food producing landscapes and farms, both to provide the necessary labour and skill needed to create and manage diverse polycultural systems, because they can't be done without labour and skill of engaged people. And also to provide the internal farm demand for minor, marginal, novel farm outputs that are not so well suited to market systems, even relatively, bioregional or even local ones, that there's always produce or something that is in abundances that are coming from the land that we say we can take advantage of this if there's people to use them. But of course, on most modern farms built into the capitalist system, there actually is hardly any people. So how do people re-inhabit the landscape is an issue in the long affluent countries like Australia with industrialised agriculture, where there's been people bled out of those rural landscapes for many decades. And the processes of how we can re-inhabit the landscape in land tenure systems where there's some sort of common land or shared land, but some sort of continuity of tenure that we can see in some forms with eco-villages. But it's perhaps part of the permaculture agenda that was there at the beginning, certainly for myself, but is in most affluent countries is yet to sort of really synergize with agricultural systems to achieve that potential. So I think those areas are important, because if we think about the permaculture vision on a broad acre scale rather than just garden agriculture scale, then it involves many, many different skill sets. The skill sets of the forester, the grazier, the beekeeper, the fish farmer, various cropping systems that are very actually difficult to manage and maintain through a single person's skill sets. And of course, we have models from the past where there was the sort of large landed gentry estates where, one person owns, but there's a lot of workers providing that complexity. I think permaculture's sort of really been associated with how can we get that complexity again, but it not be through systems where there is one dominant owner, but there is multiple use rights. So re-exploring modern forms of land tenure that can achieve what existed in a lot of traditional commons. I think that's a complex and difficult area. The third one is really bringing commercial and non-commercial food production as an integral activity to residential and urban landscapes. And that's something that permaculture has been really strongly identified with. Urban agriculture, city farms, all of the environmental and community benefits of those sorts of processes over the last few decades. But to increase the connection to the sources of sustenance and reduce dependence on transportation of perishable food, and also to make use of the surplus nutrients and water that are generated by urban systems. So that re-ruralisation of our urban landscapes, if you like, has been a very strong part of the permaculture agenda to directly bring people, urban people, not just being consumers of food through market systems, but being direct participants.
That's so interesting. Actually, that last point about, so many things you said were interesting to me, like obviously the land tenure changes, the land reform that we need. And Wendell Berry's famous comment about we need more eyes per acre, not less. And Australia famously has less and less. It all resonates. But that re-ruralization of urban spaces is a really nice phrase. I'm actually, I'm reading a lot right now about re-peasantization, which is we're getting getting the people out of the cities and onto the land. And we're seeing a beautiful movement of that happening. Perhaps not enough yet, but, you know, and part of it is that land tenure problem. And I think we're all working at it, but yeah, I have thought about obviously urban agriculture and permaculture's important role in it, but I hadn't thought of it as re-ruralization, which is a parallel, if you like, movement of the need to also re-peasantize our landscapes. So
yeah, well, certainly permaculture's been strongly associated in affluent countries with back to the land movements, which have, you know, stimulated a lot of new thinking and new efforts at smaller scale agriculture connected to local communities. But that, I suppose my retro suburbia work very emphasising that our low density residential landscapes are actually no denser in population than many traditional intensively managed agricultural landscapes where people sustained virtually all of their needs from that landscape. So that, you know, these possibilities of actually, through both the private forms of garden agriculture and more commercial urban agriculture in public spaces and larger private land holdings, that vision of a food producing city in that way, where those suburbs are really doing a lot of providing a very large proportion of the perishable food consumed by the residents of those areas.
Yeah. Do you see an opportunity? I mean, we know that a lot of that, the urban agriculture increases in places of, you know, of great disruption or economic downturns. You look across the Rust Belt in America and the thriving community gardens and things in Chicago and Detroit. And here it's been a slower burn, I think, because of a perceived lower need and certainly less inequity in our, and less abandoned spaces. But do you see an opportunity right now with the pandemic of that growing?
Yeah, well, I suppose in addition to those factors you mentioned, I think bubble economics, where land just keeps going up in value by some sort of theoretical stratospheric anti-gravity law, where it doesn't matter whether you maintain a building or not, it'll be worth more and the building will be knocked down and a larger building will be put up. When that goes into reverse and land is going down in value from its just unrealistic sort of bubble economics that's been driving affluent countries' real estate economies are no more extreme than in Australia, without even the reset that happened during the global financial crisis in countries like the United States. We're sort of set for even larger, more dramatic falls here. And when that happens, and the recognition that a lot of the building stock is actually not needed, then the processes that have happened in places like Detroit and Chicago will happen here. And of course, they'll be associated with all sorts of difficult conditions, but I think that will see a huge expansion in food production in these urban spaces. But even without that change, I think the pandemic is providing a huge boost to people just being at home and confined to home and saying, well, what's going on here? What are we doing? What are the opportunities? And of course, the huge expansion in interest in growing food and raising poultry and all of those home economics activities is also, I think, stimulated people to think about what are their local sources of food rather than lining up at Moles and Bullies in a great long queue and worrying about the shelves being empty. I think a much larger proportion of people have started to think about those alternatives.
Yeah, and in our CSA session, we certainly talked about the explosion we've seen of the CSA movement's popularity as people secure their food source
Mm.
from a farmer they can see instead of a shelf that might be bare when they walk in that day.
Yeah.
So I just have two more questions for you so that we will be able to open it up to Q&A as well. The next one's probably a fairly big one though. I'm interested in what you think permaculture has actually contributed in terms of public awareness of the importance of food sovereignty, because they're obviously very interlinked as we've been talking so far. And yeah, I guess what are the ways you think that it has anyway, and what more could we do, like within the permaculture movement, to promote the ideals of food sovereignty?
Yeah, well, I think, of course, permaculture is all over the world, and most of my experience and what I've been talking about is in the context of affluent, long industrialized countries like Australia, and it's had sort of different impacts in more rural communities of less industrialized and affluent nations. But in those affluent countries, I think it's primarily been through the growth of what I call garden farming within the household and community non-monetary economies. So by helping to rebuild a nation of food gardeners, or at least over many decades, slow the decline in the number of people who were active food gardeners, permaculture has allowed affluent people to reconnect and renew their sources of sustenance through self-reliance. But this is really the essence of and the foundation for more complex social, commercial, organisational expressions of food sovereignty. So in an article I wrote back in 1991 called Gardening as Agriculture, I addressed the question of whether isn't garden farming in direct competition with small-scale food producers serving local communities. And although that might seem quite logical, what I suggested was that people who make some effort to grow their own food understand that it's actually complicated and that it's not necessarily all automatically works one season after another, and you have to put a lot of effort into it. And you know, the quality, whether that's cosmetic quality or actual deeper understandings of quality, vary enormously. And so people who've had that experience, I argued, were more accepting and enthusiastic customers of community supported agriculture and local production, rather than being the spoilt brats going to the supermarket and only wanting the cosmetically perfect produce, all out of season and packed in sterile packaging. So that process of being engaged in it actually breeds respect for people who are small farmers producing directly for their communities. So I think that's been really important in bringing that awareness. And I think that household production also provides a learning environment for children who may grow up to become commercial producers, because of course we need to have real food sovereignty. We need more people who learn and become farmers. And that process is actually quite complex in countries where there's very few people are farmers anymore. How do we get more farmers? You know, it's not necessarily by going to university. So that process of being embedded in a household, growing up where there was food production, even if it's garden agriculture, household production as being important.
Can I just add to that point, David? I think it's a really important one. You know, a lot of our farming families in Australia, if their kids do go to university, on the off chance that, and most of them do these days, on the off chance that they study agriculture, it's to turn them into input suppliers. They go work for the corporations that supply the farmers. They don't become farmers.
Yeah.
You know, in many cases. So that is a really interesting question, like this loop of, so we've got to bring them out of the cities to get some farmers back on the land.
Yeah, and I think permaculture is really sort of has contributed over the years to that process of the recruitment of new younger people who want to become farmers. I think in poorer countries, that permaculture has helped local people identify underused local resources and opportunities to increase or reclaim food sovereignty. Sometimes because of changes in the local environment, changes from having free-flowing streams or springs to having insecure water supply, and whether it might be permaculture strategies of collecting water in tanks and dams, or it might be resources that have been seen as a waste, that could be animal manures and fertility, that previously places where things cycled enough naturally that people didn't need to focus on how to actually keep fertility cycles going. So that ability of permaculture design to look at an environment and saying, okay, what's underused here? What are resources that could be turned into something? And of course, that other role has been the introduction of new species and strains that fill missing links in local systems without increasing dependence on complex technology inputs, experts, or capital that's beyond the capacity of local economies. And in some of the most dramatic cases, just simply spiky plants that create a living fence around gardens to allow keeping out wandering livestock so people can actually grow some food. Whereas in affluent countries, people just go to the hardware store and buy some galvanized wire. So those have been sort of quite modest projects, but in many, many places, quite different sort of problems and situations, but leading to design systems which are actually quite similar to the sort of design systems that affluent people in richer countries are actually seeking to construct as well.
That's right. So it's not just a few things really that it's contributed. I think it's these movements have been growing side by side, and ultimately, well, I guess permaculture, as you say, is mimicking traditional and indigenous systems anyway, and food sovereignty comes from those systems, but they didn't coalesce as a movement until later. It's interesting to think through those parallels and how much we all have to learn together. So I guess my final question, bringing it back to specifically solidarity, is I'm wondering what more for permaculture, I guess, as a movement, and it has quite a, while there are divisions within the permaculture movement, it has quite a coherent identity of what we think permaculture is. What do you think the movement could do to help further the food sovereignty agenda going into the future? And I'm thinking here quite more specifically about political activity, even though I think that all the acts of permaculture are political. But I'm thinking about big P political, like getting engaged with political processes and further collectivizing, because the food sovereignty movement is quite good at collectivizing. And we, as you know, there's La Via Campesina, which AFSA is a member of, and the IPC for food sovereignty. We meet with the UN bodies to advocate for change. We meet with state governments and federal governments. And I feel like more of our permaculture comrades could really aid in that struggle, especially with the knowledge of those sort of cyclical and grounded ways of thinking, and how political the act of growing food can be. And I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think certainly in more affluent countries, permaculture has tended to be more apolitical, but there's a lot of people who've been involved in permaculture who would see that as to do with direct doing things, creating the world we want now, or modeling it by just doing it. rather than sort of fighting against the larger scale problem systems. But I think there's a lot of permaculture activism or people influenced by permaculture who have actually been involved in that larger political organisation, but actually through other frameworks rather than specifically calling it permaculture. And that's been both a strength and a weakness of permaculture. So in countries like Australia, there's a huge number of people that have been influenced by the concept, but the national level organisation, Permaculture Australia, is a very small volunteer organisation and doesn't have a sort of a strong public presence on policy issues or whatever. And there's people within the movement who would like to see more of that and sort of galvanise a lot of that potential. If you look at it in political terms, what's the constituency? How many people do you represent? Potentially, permaculture could be quite a significant,
absolutely,
you'd say lobby group. But if that identity was sort of drawn in, and people said, "Oh yes, everyone who was involved in permaculture or saw themselves as permaculture was a member of Permaculture Australia," that would provide a lot more of that capacity to address a lot of those issues. But I think that has been, although in some ways you could see it as a weakness, it's also been a strength in that permaculture has worked as a sort of an agent of positive influence, infiltrating society without appearing to be threatening. I mean, a lot of people have said permaculture is revolution disguised as gardening. And, so there is that aspect as well. But I suspect that in the future whether that activism and influence will be through other organisations and platforms and movements, because I think that is quite as an effective way where there can be that positive permaculture perspectives brought to those existing structures that are doing very good work and strengthening those, rather than how we build another house of activism over here.
Yeah. I'm not actually trying to say Permaculture Australia needs to become a political lobbying group. And in fact, I would be remiss as president for AFSA to not say you should actually all just join AFSA, because then we can say we have thousands of members, and it's more effective with the government. So, actually that should happen. But no, I think I agree with you that there's that element of your activism is what you do on your land, and growing your own food and rejecting corporate food systems and caring for land. I think that those are all very political activities. It just doesn't belie the need for the political lobbying as well, especially because some of our activities, as you well know, are very difficult because of current regulatory regimes that are in place to really protect industrial regimes. So
certainly there's that strategy of the solidarity with farmers who are at the front line of these situations, and that's something that I've always advocated within the permaculture movement, that support is really important. I've emphasised, for example, also that the vulnerabilities we have in relation to sustainable methods of grain production in this country, that many people might think quite a bit about where their vegetables and fruit come from, but then just resort to buying crap industrial flour from centralised systems. And meanwhile, we have these relative handfuls of successful organic and biodynamic broadacre grain farmers in this country who are really a precious asset that there's so few of them, and that we can't easily produce what they produce in our backyards, so that support for those people and making those connections like very, very critical sort of knowledge resources and that we need to build and extend. And that really does come from those farming families, who some of them now multi-generational families, who've been at the forefront of developing those techniques for the production of our staples in ways that are more sustainable.
Yeah, actually, I should just mention grains, the grains movement, GRAINZ, which is Australia, New Zealand grain growers and bakers and people who are interested in those things. The fact that they have collectivized as a movement and have had a number of conferences now around, or whatever you call them, around the country, has helped grow their numbers. So I think the grains movement is in fact growing because they are actively collectivizing. I have to say though, you can't grow it in your backyard, it's true, but I do have my first row of hard red wheat growing this year. It's an elaborate ploy to get a grain mill in my house. And I think I'll get at least 2 or 3 loaves of bread from it. But yeah, it's pretty hard to grow all the grain for your bread for the year, that's for sure. Now we're going to go to questions, and I can see Corinne has just asked one about a national register for CSAs and biodynamic farmers. So I would say 2 things. I think Amita, who's here helping us with AFSA, will probably give you some links in a minute, but there's the Open Food Network is the best online platform to find all of the kinds of growers that we'd be talking about, but not everybody's there, but those who are selling online are on Open Food Network. There is a national network called the CSA Network Australia New Zealand, or it might be Australia New Zealand CSA Network. I think it's the first, and they've been collating the CSA farmers in Australia, and I think we're up to, it's still not that many. It's like maybe 50 or something in the country, but it's growing. When we first started as a CSA, there were about 3 of us. So in a short time, the numbers have grown quite a lot. And who else would I recommend? Open Food Network, CSA Australia Network. There's another website called Flavor Crusader, and she kind of canvasses all of these small scale growers. And one of her criteria is that you can't sell to the duopoly or she won't list you. So I like that it's not only about the production practices, it's about the practices of distribution. And I think that's really, really wonderful. So we'll open it up. If anyone else, if you have other questions, I'll try to go to my gallery view so I can see. If you turn your cameras on, and if you have a question for David, well, or AFSA, but probably David. I can see Meg's turned on her camera. Is that just to say hello? Or do you have a question? Hi, Meg and Patrick.
More local folk.
That's right. Are there really in all these people?
There was something else I wanted to mention briefly, was an extended essay called Feeding Retro-Suburbia from the Backyard to the Bioregion, which I wrote to sort of complement the work in the Retro-Suburbia book, to sort of give people a sense who are doing stuff in their backyards. How does that fit in to a vision for a bioregional food system? And, you know, in that I suggest the proportions of food that could come from rural hinterlands and urban commercial agriculture and garden farming and wild harvesting, and relating that to actually a change in diet, using the Australian sort of average diet as a base to then sort of create what I called the retro-suburban diet, not in the sense of a prescription of what people should eat, but what I thought people on average would be consuming as part of a a sustainable, localized bioregional food system that was working with the limits of climate and optimizing the use of land resources, so that habits of what we eat, of course, is a big part of the changes that are needed.
Totally. I actually would like to read that. Do you have a copy of that somewhere?
So that's online at the Retro Suburbia website, as a sort of like a little downloadable ebook. It's quite an extensive
Thanks, David.
essay with also a framework of looking at how urban areas and their hinterlands actually can work together. And it was actually not about how you would redesign feeding a city the size of Melbourne from its hinterland, but more taking realistically that we are talking about parallel food systems developing, while those large centralised systems clearly, even if they have some reform, will continue to sort of chug on and towards that greater centralisation and control, while we are building a parallel system in the shadows of that larger one, because clearly reform processes of that larger system may happen and are necessary, but we also have to build this parallel system. So I was sort of imagining, yeah, what if 20% of the population were, you know, actively in households that were had active gardening and food production, buying from their local CSAs, direct connection to farmers and other local networks. What would that actually look like if it was, you know, 20% of the population rather than maybe 2%? I don't know what it is at the moment that is working at those scales, but yeah, so we do need some of that vision of what this realistically could be, and that we can create by our actions as producers and consumers.
Yep. Thanks, David. Now, I think we've got two lined up for questions. Unfortunately, one of you's name is iPhone. So, oh, he's gone. Did you want to ask a question or no? No? Okay. Annalise, though, is here and perhaps has a question.
Yeah, I have a question, but I'm still kind of formulating it, so it might come out a bit.
Yeah, go for it.
How you going? I've just started the Regen Ag program at Southern Cross Uni, and it's a bit weird going into a cohort of students where heaps of the students are actually farmers, which is pretty cool. But like a lot of the discussions I'm hearing in the Regen Ag world are about like, and we're talking about permaculture, not Regen Ag, but some of the stuff we're talking about, like there's a lot of overlap. Like I'm hearing people talking about food production systems in terms of like kilograms per hectare, and how sustainable farming revolutions can like increase profitability, and like that kind of leads into this thing that I see happening of like KFC and General Mills adopting sustainable farming practices. And there's kind of this thread I'm seeing of people saying that we can't change our food systems without it being scalable, without having like a seat at the big players table. Like it's not worth trying to change anything at all unless it can go mainstream. So I'm trying to figure out like how to approach that conversation with people who are actually farming and trying to like make a crust, trying to earn a living, and but deal with this thread in the conversation that inherently seems wrong, when I feel like true sustainability is in decentralized systems, not having a seat at the big players table. So like that's not a very well formed question, because I'm trying to like pull these threads together that we've been talking about. But I'd love to hear like, what do you say to people who don't think small scale, localized, community-led solutions are a global, like permanent solution?
Yeah, well, I mean, what you've raised is a sort of a perennial issue in any sort of activism or just processes of how we work out how we can survive and hopefully thrive in whatever we're doing. It's the reform versus revolution argument, if you like. And obviously, I come from a long lineage that more at the revolution end, in the sense of that we need to redesign things from first principles, that there's so many examples of where we can see this in the broad field we might call sustainable agriculture, where we find something which is actually represents part of the solution, and then it gets turned back into the same old problem. So of course the permaculture aphorism is, the problem is the solution. Look at the problem and how to sort of transform that into the solution, whether it's thinking about weeds or thinking about some wasted byproduct that might be able to be used. But we can see examples where, not so often, where we can say, here's a biological solution rather than a technological fossil fuel powered solution to productivity. Whether it's, say, something like tree crops, tree fodder systems. In the 80s, I got very excited about the evidence we were seeing on the extraordinary agricultural productivity of Tagasasti, for example, double and triple the edible dry matter per hectare that was than we could get from our best clover ryegrass pastures. So you can see occasionally examples where the biologically sustainable solution actually trumps the current industrialized ones. And yet, as soon as those emerge, that same system will turn it back into the problem. So the example was in Western Australia, through that sort of production in the 80s, there was already 64,000 hectares of direct seeded Tagasasti on sandy country that was increasing productivity. And then someone came up with a plan to actually pelletize all this and send it to Japan, to those cows that they massage and turn it into intensive feedlot feed. So that sort of thing where we can see the same, to some extent, happened with organic food through the certification process of how we funnel all that to the richest consumers in the most affluent countries. Now, clearly, organic agriculture in its great lineage didn't start that way, but through the certification and globalized marketing systems and that development. So yes, you can walk into the centralized supermarket systems and that food is there. We can see how those things may be a step forward for some particular farmers, or to have a success in some more limited sense. But we can see how that moves back into the same exploitative and destructive cycles, over the longer term. So I think the issue of whether the small scale systems are relevant is partly people assume that because there's this huge demand for food in the world, then the systems that produce that must be big, and that any system must grow in scale. Whereas what they forget is cellular replication is the main way that growth happens in nature. So, and yet the assumption is, oh yes, if this farming system is successful, then it should suddenly be covering, you know, thousands of hectares of the same, exactly the same system to match the scale of those centralized systems. The other way is that it can scale by reproduction. You know, so this farm informs another farm, and that system acts as a model for replication. And with modern information systems, the capacity to do that and the spread of knowledge and refine and improve systems rather than sort of forcing something into one large package. The other argument of why it's important is that the sustainability crisis, and a lot of that is seen in the public domain as the climate crisis, but it's actually at so many different levels that anything that we say, oh yeah, this is sort of suddenly the answer because we've got this, we've dealt with some particular problem. Oh, we're increasing soil carbon where before we were depleting soil carbon. So suddenly we've got a system that we've fixed things. You know, constantly new limits to those systems show up. So the redesign from first principles is really essential, and having a lot of different experiments running is a response to chaotic, constant change in your conditions. If you say, oh, this looks like the answer, it's almost certainly going to fail in a rapidly changing environment. So you want lots and lots of different experimentation, lots and lots of different models, and in different places, yeah, some of those systems will fall over, but other ones will survive. So it's about, you know, strategically not putting all our eggs in one basket. But, you know, the other thing that I would advise any farmer is don't believe you can ever negotiate with moles and bullies and trade with them. You can't. It's structural, and it's not just that those corporations are sort of evil. Something at orders of magnitude larger scale inevitably has an exploitative relationship to something much smaller. Trade occurs between like-scaled entities inherently in nature and in economic systems. So, and we can see that of what's happened over the years with successful organic producers being lured in to those centralized systems and then becoming very, very beholden to them and easily being switched off or dispensed with if someone on the other side of the world can do it cheaper.
Thanks, Annalise. That was a great question. And thanks, David. That was a great answer. And there have been some really nice comments in the chat as well about, you know, the need for reform. We, as I think it was, just look back to see, Amanda King said, we do want the big guys who are clapping out their soil to reform at very least. But whether that's the end goal, I think probably people here wouldn't think it is. You know, the iterative change has its place, but the people here probably think a lot more radically about where we need to be. And I like that comment too about, can people be content, or the question, can people be content with a smaller scale and not need to become gigantic? And I feel like a future session that AFSA needs to host is around degrowth, and the concept of degrowth and what it can, some people misunderstand the term, but the point being the radical abundance we can have in a degrowth world, to help people to appreciate that it's not a world of want, it's a world of plenty when you actually live within your kind of ecological and social boundaries. I can see you're on time. I don't know if Lindsay, who's got your screen on, did you have a question? No? Okay. That's all right. Then I think we're at time, and we might just, I need to just say, I mentioned Open Food Network earlier. They're currently running a survey on the impact of COVID on food systems and what's making our food systems more or less resilient. And if you're a food producer or working in the food system at all, they would really welcome your input to the survey. And it's an ongoing project with a lot of international researchers, so you can actually update your information later on.
The survey's finished, Tammy.
Sorry?
The survey's now finished. It's closed.
The Open Food Network survey?
Is that the same one as Sustain?
No.
Oh.
No, not at all. They're not at all the same. That's like an urban gardening one, isn't it? The Sustain one?
I think so, yes.
No, this is a much broader food system survey. And I think it is, yeah, Amita's just shared it there. The link is in the chat. And yeah, like I said, if you're in the food system, they'd really welcome your input. It was pretty interesting for me filling it out, just some thinking about the ways, because we're community supported agriculture, the ways we're resilient, but then the ways that we're not, and what are we doing about that? And those things about decoupling from corporate systems and commodity systems is a big part of that. So yes, thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you especially to David for coming along and sharing your thoughts on permaculture and food sovereignty. It's been great. I've actually really enjoyed this, unsurprisingly. I don't know why I say actually. And somebody's asked if these are going to be recorded available. Yes, they're going onto the AFSA website, and as of now-ish, AFSA now has a YouTube channel, which we'll say something about on the Facebook page soon. And all of our previous recordings are going to be on there, as well as future ones. The next one actually is going to be, Amita, I'm forgetting, is the next one with Farmer Incubator, or is it with, which is about supporting the emerging movement of farmers? And we've got one coming up with the New Economies Network Australia as well. And I'm sure in that one, we'll be talking about degrowth quite a lot. So lots more to do to keep sharing all the good work of people like Dave and Sue and others, just doing a great job building the new world that we want to see and live in. So thank you. And thank you to Amita for doing an excellent support job and hosting it and doing all the technology and all your work for AFSA, of course.
Yeah, and thanks, Tammy, for the work you do both out in the world and on the farm.
Thanks, Dave. It's happy work. Well, not always. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. If you want to turn on your cameras before you say goodbye and give us a wave. It's been a pleasure. The recording, like I said, will be up soon. If you want to tell your friends if they missed out, that they can see. Thanks. It's lovely to see your faces.
Thank you.
Keep doing good work, everyone. Bye.